The inheritance of dust and the hidden key to my father's second life. They say you never truly know a person until you've walked a mile in their shoes. But I've come to believe something different. Something a bit more haunting. I think you never truly know a person until you've emptied their house after they're gone. My father, Elias Thorne, was a man of absolute, unbreakable routines. For 40 years, I watched him like a clock. He woke up at 5:30 every single morning, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. He drank his coffee black while reading the physical newspaper, the ink staining his fingertips gray. Then, he'd put on a pressed white shirt, a silk tie, and head to his mid-level management job at a local insurance firm. He was predictable. He was the kind of man who color-coded his spice rack. He sharpened his lawnmower blades every spring on the exact same Saturday. He didn't tell jokes. He didn't tell stories. He just existed in a state of perfect, gray order. When he passed away last October, the world didn't stop turning. The neighbors gave me the usual, sorry for your loss casseroles. The insurance company sent a form letter, and I was left with a 3-bedroom house in suburban Ohio that felt less like a home and more like a museum of boredom. I expected the cleanup to be easy. I expected to find a neat stack of tax returns, a life insurance policy, and maybe a few old faded photos of my mother, whom we lost when I was just a toddler. I figured I'd be done in a weekend. But life, or maybe death, has a funny way of kicking you when you think you have everything figured out. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The house was quiet. That heavy, stifling silence that only exists in places where someone used to live. I was in his study, a room that always smelled of old paper, cedar shavings, and peppermint. I was moving his heavy mahogany desk. It was a massive piece of furniture, the kind they don't make anymore. He had sat at that desk every night for decades, calculating premiums and paying bills with a fountain pen. As I pushed against the side of it, my work boot slipped, and I felt it. A slight, hollow give in the floorboard. Now, you have to understand. My father hated imperfection. If a floorboard squeaked, he fixed it. If a door hinge groaned, he oiled it. So, the fact that there was a loose board under his most prized possession, it felt like a personal insult to his memory. It felt wrong. I knelt down, my heart starting to do this strange, rhythmic thumping against my ribs. I grabbed a flathead screwdriver from his toolbox and pried at the edge. The wood groaned, the old nails resisting, until pop. The board came up. I expected to see dust bunnies, or maybe a rogue marble from my childhood. Instead, I saw steel. Buried in the subfloor was a heavy, military-grade lockbox, and taped to the top of it, with yellowed Scotch tape, was a single, rusted skeleton key. I sat there on the floor for a long time. The shadows in the room grew longer, stretching across the carpet like skeletal fingers. I just stared at that key. My father and I, we weren't close. We were how's the weather, and did you change your oil close? He never talked about his childhood. He never talked about his dreams. He was just a man in a suit who came home at 6 p.m. But this box? This box was a secret. And in my father's world, secrets were a foreign currency. I took the key. My hands were shaking. Just a little bit. I slid it into the lock. It was stiff, protesting years of being buried in the dark. I turned it. Hard. Click. The sound echoed through the empty house like a gunshot. I lifted the lid. I don't know what I expected. Gold bars? A hidden will? A picture of a secret family? Inside the box were 3 things. First, a hand-drawn map of a small town in northern Pennsylvania called Oak Haven. I'd lived in the tri-state area my whole life, and I'd never heard of it. Second, a thick envelope stuffed with cash. I counted it twice. $20,000, all in old crisp $100 bills from the 1990s. And third, a legal deed for a property titled The Bluebird Sanctuary. I felt a cold sweat prickle the back of my neck. My boring father had a $20,000 secret. He had a property I never knew existed. He had a second life. The next morning, I didn't call the realtor to list the house. I didn't go back to my soul-crushing job at the marketing firm. I didn't even call my girlfriend to tell her where I was going. I got in my truck, threw a duffel bag in the back, and drove north. The drive took 6 hours. As I crossed the border into Pennsylvania, the landscape changed. The highways turned into 2-lane roads that snaked through dense forests and over crumbling stone bridges. Oak Haven wasn't on the main GPS. I had to follow the hand-drawn landmarks my father had sketched on that map. "I'll turn left at the lightning-struck oak," the map said. "Follow the creek until the road turns to gravel." It was a place designed to be forgotten. When I finally reached the coordinates on the deed, I pulled over and just sat there, the engine idling. It was a small, dilapidated cottage sitting on the edge of a black water lake. The wood was gray and weathered, looking like the skin of an old elephant. The porch was sagging dangerously to the left, and the windows were so clouded with grime you couldn't see inside. It looked like a ghost lived there. "Can I help you, son?" I jumped so hard I nearly hit my head on the roof of the truck. An old man was standing at the edge of the tall grass. He was wearing faded denim overalls and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. He was leaning on a rusted garden rake, watching me with eyes that were unnervingly blue. I'm looking for Elias Thorne," I said, my voice sounding thin in the mountain air. The old man's expression shifted. He took off his sweat-stained cap and ran a hand over a bald head. He let out a long, slow breath. "Well," he said softly, "I reckon you're about 6 months too late for that. Elias passed." He paused, looking me up and down. "But you have his jawline. And those eyes. You must be Caleb." My heart stopped. He talked about me? The man laughed, but it was a dry, sad sound, like leaves skittering across a sidewalk. "Talked about you? Kid? Elias Thorne spent 30 years building this whole place for you." The old man's name was Silas. He had been the caretaker of the sanctuary for 3 decades, paid in cash via a P.O. box every month. He led me toward the cottage, the tall grass whispering against our jeans. "Your father was a strange one," Silas said as he fished a key from his pocket. "He'd come up here once a year, always in the fall. He'd stay for exactly 3 days. He wouldn't bring a phone, wouldn't bring a radio, had just work." "Work on what?" I asked. "He was an insurance manager. He didn't know how to build anything." Silas looked at me and winked. "That's what he wanted you to think." He pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of my father's study. There was no peppermint here. It smelled of cedar, linseed oil, and something sweet, like wild jasmine. The interior was a revelation. It wasn't a house, it was a workshop. But it wasn't a messy workshop. It was an artist's studio. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were hundreds of wood carvings. Not just any carvings. Birds. Thousands of them. Bluebirds, hawks, tiny sparrows. All carved with such intricate detail, you expected them to burst into song. They were delicate, beautiful, and filled with a life that my father never showed at the dinner table. But it was the back room that broke me. Silas stood back, letting me enter the small bedroom at the rear of the cottage. It was a nursery, but it wasn't a nursery for a ghost. It was a perfectly preserved, handcrafted room from 30 years ago. In the center sat a cradle carved from cherry wood. It was polished until it shone like a mirror. I ran my hand along the rail, and it felt like silk. On the walls, someone had painted a mural. It was a forest, filled with sunlight and hidden animals. It was whimsical. It was joyful. "He bought this place the year you were born," Silas whispered from the doorway. "He and your mother, they had a vision. They hated the city. They hated the gray suits and the concrete. They were going to move here. Elias was going to sell his carvings, and your mother was going to teach music in the village." I looked at the cradle. "Why didn't they?" "Because the world is a cruel place, Caleb," Silas said. "Your mother got sick. The medical bills piled up. Elias had to take that job at the insurance firm just to keep the lights on and pay for her treatments. When she passed, he couldn't bring himself to live here. But he couldn't let the dream die either. I sat down on a small wooden stool my father had clearly built by hand. So, he lived a double life. He thought he was protecting you, Silas said. He told me once that he didn't want you to grow up unstable. He thought if you saw him as a dreamer, you'd become one too, and he was terrified you'd end up heartbroken and broke, just like he felt. He traded his own soul to make sure your floorboards didn't squeak. I stayed in Oak Haven for 3 months. I didn't go back to Ohio. I called my girlfriend and told her the truth, and she told me I was crazy. Maybe I was. I used that $20,000 from the lockbox to save the sanctuary. I hired Silas to help me fix the roof. We spent weeks scraping the grime off the windows until the sunlight flooded the workshop, hitting the wooden birds and making them look like they were catching fire. I found my father's journals in a trunk under the bed. They weren't filled with insurance math. They were filled with poetry. They were filled with observations about the way the light hits the lake at dawn. In the very last journal, dated just weeks before he died, there was a single entry. Caleb is 30 now. He has a steady job. He has a safe life. I look at him, and I see a man who is asleep. I hope he finds the key. I hope he hates me for a minute, and then I hope he wakes up. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. I realized that my father's predictable life was the ultimate sacrifice. He wore the suit so I wouldn't have to. He stayed in the gray so I could live in the color. On my final night at the cottage before I officially moved my things in, I found one last secret. I was cleaning the cherry wood cradle, preparing it for a friend who was having a baby. As I wiped down the bottom slats, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked into a hidden groove in the wood. It was a letter, handwritten. To my son, it began. If you're reading this, it means you've finally discovered who I was. I spent my life being a ghost in a white shirt. I did it because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I showed you the real me, the man who loved the smell of sawdust more than the smell of money, I wouldn't be able to protect you when the world got cold. I wanted you to have a life that was certain, a life where the bills were paid and the future was mapped out. But as I sit here in this quiet house in Ohio, I realize I made a mistake. Security is a cage, Caleb. It's a comfortable cage, but it's a cage nonetheless. I hope you find the Bluebird Sanctuary. I hope you see the birds. And I hope you realize that you don't owe me anything. You don't have to be safe for my sake. Take the money, fix the house, or burn it down and go to the ocean. Just don't be predictable. Don't let your life be a series of gray Tuesdays. I didn't burn it down. I quit the marketing firm. I didn't go back to the suburbs. I turned the Bluebird Sanctuary into a school, a place where kids from the city can come to learn how to carve, how to paint, and how to breathe. I'm 31 now. My hands are constantly covered in sawdust. My clothes are stained with linseed oil. I don't own a single white shirt. Every morning, I wake up at 5:30. But I don't read the paper. I walk down to the lake with Buster, my father's old dog that I took in, and I watch the sun rise over the water. And sometimes, when the workshop is quiet, I can almost hear the scratch of a fountain pen. It's my father. He's not an insurance manager anymore. He's the man who built a sanctuary out of dust and silence. Because the greatest inheritance isn't a house or a stack of cash. It's the realization that it's never, ever, too late to change your own story. I finally figured it out, Dad.